In the early hours of March 1943, across the waters of the southwestern Pacific, a Japanese naval convoy pushed forward through ocean swells with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of naval dominance. The commanders aboard those vessels had every reason to believe in their mission's success. Behind them stretched a proud history of victories, and ahead lay what they considered a routine resupply operation. 8 massive transport vessels cut through the waves, their holds packed with nearly 7,000 soldiers from the Imperial Army's 51st Division. These men represented Japan's commitment to holding its hard-won territorial gains in New Guinea, where garrisons desperately awaited reinforcement and resupply. The convoy was far from defenceless. 8 destroyers formed a protective screen around the transports, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft weaponry, and their crews trained to perfection in the art of convoy defense. These warships embodied decades of Japanese naval doctrine, vessels designed and crewed specifically to create what military strategists called an umbrella of steel. This defensive philosophy had proven itself time and again throughout the Pacific campaign. When enemy aircraft appeared, coordinated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships would create such intense barrages that attackers were either driven off or shot down before they could deliver their payloads effectively. The sailors manning those guns had drilled endlessly for exactly this scenario. They knew their stations intimately, could load and fire with mechanical precision even under the stress of combat, and had been taught to believe absolutely in the effectiveness of their defensive systems. Their officers had studied every previous engagement, analysing how Allied bombers typically approached and what defensive measures proved most successful. The conclusion was always the same: maintain formation, keep guns firing in coordinated patterns, execute sharp evasive manoeuvres, and the convoy would survive to complete its mission. This confidence wasn't merely bravado or blind faith. The Imperial Japanese Navy had accumulated considerable evidence supporting their tactical doctrine. American high-altitude bombing runs against moving ships had proven notoriously ineffective throughout 1942 and early 1943. Bombs dropped from thousands of feet rarely found their targets, and even near misses did little damage to warships designed to withstand punishment. Torpedo attacks, while potentially more devastating, required aircraft to make long, straight approach runs at low altitude, exposing them to concentrated fire for extended periods. Japanese gunners had shot down numerous torpedo bombers before they could release their weapons, and those that did launch often missed their targets anyway, as destroyers executed violent evasive turns. Meanwhile, on distant airfields scattered across northern Australia and the eastern tip of New Guinea, a very different atmosphere prevailed. American and Australian air crews understood with bitter clarity that conventional tactics were failing. The frustration ran deep among pilots who risked their lives attacking Japanese convoys only to watch their bombs splash harmlessly into the ocean or their torpedo runs get torn apart by defensive fire. Something fundamental had to change, but military bureaucracy and established doctrine resisted innovation at almost every turn. Into this stagnant tactical situation stepped several remarkable individuals who refused to accept that the current methods represented the only possibilities. Among them was Paul Gunn, known universally as Pappy, a former naval aviator who had transitioned to the Army Air Forces and brought with him both extensive experience and a willingness to question established assumptions. Gunn had spent enough time in the Pacific theatre to recognise that the tools currently available simply weren't adequate for the job that needed doing, and he possessed enough mechanical aptitude and creative vision to imagine alternatives. Working from facilities at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, Gunn assembled a small team of mechanics and began experimenting with radical modifications to the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The standard configuration of this aircraft included a glazed nose section housing a bombardier who would aim and release bombs from high altitude. Gunn proposed something that seemed almost absurd on its surface. Remove the entire bombardier compartment and replace it with machine guns pointed straight ahead. Not 1 or 2 guns, but multiple heavy weapons that would transform the bomber into something unprecedented. a flying weapons platform capable of directing devastating forward firepower at surface targets. The technical challenges were substantial. Mounting heavy machine guns in an aircraft nose required reinforcing the entire structure to handle recoil forces that the original designers never anticipated. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns Gunn wanted to install generated tremendous forces when firing, and without proper bracing, they could literally tear apart the nose section. Ammunition feed systems had to be designed and installed, belts of rounds had to be stored where they could be accessed reliably, and mechanisms to prevent jams during violent maneuvering had to be devised through trial and error. The first installations featured 4 forward-firing guns, already a formidable concentration of firepower. But as the concept proved itself in testing, the modifications became more ambitious. Eventually, Gunn's team managed to install 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose of modified B-25s, creating what would become one of the most fearsome weapons systems in the Pacific War. The killing power of this arrangement was almost beyond comprehension. Each individual weapon could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute, and the armor-piercing incendiary ammunition they used could penetrate steel plate and set fire to anything combustible it struck. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they generated a stream of nearly 7,000 rounds per minute, directed at whatever target the pilot aimed the nose at. This concentration of fire could soar through ship superstructures, shred anti-aircraft gun positions, kill dozens of sailors in seconds, and generally create havoc that no ship's crew could withstand. The psychological effect was equally important. Sailors who survived encounters with these modified bombers described the experience as facing down a demon made of fire and steel, watching 8 flickering muzzle flashes emerge from the nose of an onrushing aircraft, and knowing that death was pouring toward them faster than human reaction time could process. But the gun installation was only half of the innovation equation. Around the same time, other American aviators were developing a bombing technique that would complement the strafing firepower perfectly. Traditional level bombing from high altitude had proven ineffective against ships for the simple reason that a bomb falling from several miles up took many seconds to reach the target, during which time a ship could maneuver unpredictably. Even the best bombardiers struggled to hit maneuvering vessels consistently. The solution came from pilots willing to fly at wave-top height and effectively throw their bombs at ships from extremely close range. The technique, which became known as skip bombing, involved approaching a target at minimum altitude, sometimes just feet above the ocean surface, and releasing bombs with delayed fuses at precisely calculated moments. If executed correctly, the bombs would skip across the water's surface much like a stone skipped by a child, travelling horizontally toward the target ship before slamming into its hull at or near the waterline. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group became one of the primary advocates and instructors for this technique. His crews practiced religiously against the rusting hulk of a ship called the SS Pruth, learning through repetition exactly when to release, how to angle their approach, and what results to expect. The method demanded extraordinary nerve because it required pilots to fly straight toward a target that would be shooting back at them with everything it had, maintaining course and speed even as tracers streaked past their cockpits and anti-aircraft shells exploded nearby. The accuracy, however, was undeniable. Bombs skipped in this manner struck their targets with far greater reliability than high-altitude drops ever could. More importantly, they hit at the waterline where ships are most vulnerable, punching holes below the surface that flooded compartments and sent vessels to the bottom with terrifying speed. When combined with the suppressive strafing fire from forward-mounted guns, the tactic became devastatingly effective. The strafers would arrive first, their concentrated machine gun fire sweeping decks clear of anti-aircraft crews and generally creating chaos. Seconds later, the skip bombers would arrive, their crews free to concentrate on accurate delivery without facing the full weight of a ship's defensive armament. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, recognized immediately what his subordinates had created. Here was a weapon system that played to American strengths in mechanical innovation and aircrew training while exploiting Japanese tactical rigidity. Kenny threw his full support behind converting entire squadrons of B-25s into strafers and training crews in skip bombing techniques. By early March 1943, the modifications and training had reached the point where the new tactics were ready for full-scale combat testing. Meanwhile, the Japanese convoy continued its journey across the Bismarck Sea, completely unaware that the rules of engagement were about to change in ways their doctrine had never contemplated. The soldiers packed into the transport ship's holds lived in uncomfortable conditions, surrounded by equipment and supplies, many suffering from seasickness as the vessels rolled through ocean swells. Most were young men, drafted into service and trained in the harsh discipline of the Imperial Army. They wrote letters home when they could, talked about their families, speculated about what awaited them at their destination, and tried not to think too deeply about the dangers of ocean travel in wartime. On the destroyers, the atmosphere was more professional, but no less tense. Sailors maintained their stations, officers reviewed defensive plans, and lookouts scanned endless horizons for any sign of enemy presence. The convoy maintained radio silence as much as possible, hoping to slip across contested waters without attracting attention. Intelligence reports suggested that Allied reconnaissance aircraft had likely spotted them, but that was expected. The question wasn't whether the enemy knew they were there, but rather what kind of attack would develop and whether the convoy's defences could repel it successfully. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, the overall commander, had every reason to believe they could. His flagship's Combat Information Centre tracked known Allied air bases and estimated what kind of forces might be dispatched against them. The analysis suggested the usual pattern: high-altitude bombers that could be evaded through manoeuvres and aggressive anti-aircraft fire, possibly some torpedo planes that would have to be dealt with through coordinated defensive procedures. Nothing in the intelligence suggested that Allied air power had developed any fundamentally new capability that might threaten a properly defended convoy. This assessment reflected a broader problem within Japanese military thinking at this stage of the war. Initial spectacular successes had bred a certain complacency, a belief that Japanese training and spirit would always prove superior to American industrial might and technical innovation. Officers who had fought at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, had seen American forces defeated again and again. The idea that those same forces might suddenly develop war-winning technologies or tactics seemed unlikely at best. But innovation rarely announces itself through official intelligence channels. The modifications being made to B-25 bombers in Australian workshops didn't appear in any reports reaching Japanese headquarters. The skip bombing training occurring against hulks in remote harbours went unobserved by enemy reconnaissance. When breakthrough developments happen at operational levels rather than strategic ones, there's often a deadly lag between the innovation's deployment and the enemy's recognition that something fundamental has changed. As dawn broke on March 3, 1943, ground crews at Allied airfields across New Guinea completed final preparations on dozens of aircraft. Mechanics topped off fuel tanks, armoured up ammunition, checked control surfaces, and did all the small tasks that kept aircraft flying and crews alive. Pilots attended final briefings where target information was reviewed, approach paths were memorised, and timing was synchronised. Everyone involved understood that this mission represented something unprecedented in scale and tactical approach. Success could validate months of work and innovation. Failure would cost lives and possibly set back the entire campaign in New Guinea. The emotional weight of these moments before combat is difficult to convey to those who haven't experienced it. Young men, some barely out of their teens, preparing to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where one hit could be instantly fatal. Some handled the stress through jokes and banter, maintaining a facade of confidence even as fear gnawed at them. Others grew quiet and withdrawn, checking and rechecking their equipment, going through private rituals that helped center their minds. A few wrote final letters, just in case, and entrusted them to friends who would be remaining behind. The aircraft themselves represented thousands of hours of modification work. The gun-laden B-25 strafers looked brutish and purposeful, their noses studded with weapon barrels, their overall appearance suggesting exactly what they were designed to do. The skip bombers carried their ordnance with delayed fuses carefully set, each bomb positioned to skip precisely when released at the right speed and altitude. Australian crews flying Beaufighters added their aircraft to the strike package, their 20mm cannons and .303 machine guns providing additional firepower for the assault. One by one, engines coughed to life, propellers began spinning, and the distinctive roar of multiple aircraft preparing for takeoff filled the tropical air. Pilots advanced throttles, felt their aircraft begin to roll, pulled back on control yokes at precisely the right moment, and lifted into humid morning air. Formation flying began immediately. Aircraft maneuvering into practiced positions, crews scanning for their assigned positions in the strike package. The mission required careful coordination between different aircraft types attacking from different angles at different altitudes, and any breakdown in timing could reduce effectiveness or increase friendly fire risks. As the strike force climbed to altitude and turned toward their target area, the Japanese convoy maintained its course with no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. Morning watch crews scanned skies and seas, alert but not alarmed. In the transport's holds, soldiers tried to sleep or played cards or simply endured the discomfort of overcrowded conditions. Officers in the destroyer's combat information centers tracked their progress, calculated arrival times, and maintained communication with escorting fighters that were supposed to provide additional air cover. The first contact came from high-flying reconnaissance aircraft that Japanese lookouts spotted at significant distance. This triggered exactly the response that doctrine called for. Alarm signals, gun crews rushing to stations, officers barking commands, the entire convoy shifting into defensive posture. Sailors grabbed helmets, donned life preservers, and took their assigned positions. Gun captains checked ammunition supplies, adjusted weapon angles, and prepared to engage targets at expected high altitudes. What appeared on the horizon initially seemed to confirm their expectations. A formation of American bombers approached at several thousand feet altitude, following the standard pattern for high-level attacks. Gun crews tracked the formation, calculated approach angles, and prepared to fill the sky with defensive fire. Anti-aircraft shells began bursting around the high-flying aircraft, creating dark puffs of smoke and shrapnel. Some shells exploded close enough to rattle windows and make airframes shudder, but the bombers maintained formation and continued their approach. Japanese gunners felt the familiar rush of combat, the satisfaction of seeing their fire force enemy aircraft to scatter or alter course. Officers observed the developing engagement and felt confident that once again, disciplined defensive fire would protect the convoy from serious harm. Even if some bombs were released, the chances of actually hitting maneuvering ships from high altitude remained vanishingly small. But then something entirely unexpected happened. A different sound began to register, barely audible at first beneath the thunder of anti-aircraft guns and the roar of ship engines. This sound was lower, closer, rising from the ocean surface itself. Lookouts who turned their attention downward suddenly saw a nightmare made real. Aircraft racing just above the waves, so low that spray kicked up from their propellers, approaching at tremendous speed with their noses pointed directly at the convoy like lances aimed at targets. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Every sailor in the convoy had been trained to watch the skies above, to track high-flying threats, to engage aircraft at altitude where they expected them to be. The sudden appearance of attackers at wave-top height, coming in so fast that reaction time was measured in seconds rather than minutes, created instant confusion and panic. Gun crews tried to depress their weapons rapidly enough to engage these unexpected threats, but many anti-aircraft guns simply couldn't angle down far enough to hit targets flying at such minimal altitude. Major Edward Larner, leading the first wave of strafers in his aircraft nicknamed Ruthless, closed to effective range and pressed the firing button. 8 streams of tracer fire erupted from his nose, creating what appeared to be solid lines of light connecting his aircraft to the destroyer Shirayuki. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Armor-piercing rounds punched through steel plating, shredded bridge windows, tore apart crew members, destroyed vital equipment, and generally transformed an organized warship into a scene of carnage in the span of seconds. The sailors manning Shirayuki's guns had no chance to react effectively. One moment they were tracking targets in the sky above. The next moment they were being torn apart by concentrated machine gun fire from a direction their training had never emphasized. The destroyer's bridge, where officers had been coordinating defensive efforts, became a charnel house. Control stations were wrecked, steering mechanisms damaged, communication systems destroyed. Within 10 seconds of coming under attack, Shirayuki had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit, even though her hull remained afloat. Lieutenant John Hennebrey selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his target, lining up his approach with the precision that weeks of training had instilled. His finger squeezed the trigger, and 8 guns began their deadly work, walking tracers from the transport's bow toward her stern, systematically destroying everything in their path. The bridge dissolved into flying glass and twisted metal. Officers died at their posts. The helmsman was cut down, his body slumping over controls. And then Hennebrey released his skip bombs, watching them bounce across the water's surface before slamming into Kyokusei Maru's hull just above the waterline. The delayed fuses worked exactly as designed. For a fraction of a second after impact, nothing seemed to happen. Then the bombs detonated deep within the transport's hull, blasting through bulkheads, rupturing fuel lines, igniting stored ammunition, and creating explosive pressure waves that propagated through compartments filled with soldiers. Men who had been sitting in crowded spaces below deck never even understood what killed them. The explosions ripped through the ship faster than human consciousness could process, and Kyokusei Maru began her death throes immediately. All around the convoy, similar scenes played out in rapid succession. The Australian bowfighters screamed in at low level, their 20mm cannons hammering anti-aircraft positions, their machine guns cutting down sailors who tried to man their stations. More strafers arrived in coordinated waves, each pilot selecting targets, unleashing devastating bursts of fire, releasing skip bombs that bounced toward hulls with mechanical precision. The bombs struck with tremendous force, their delayed detonations tearing open ships from within, creating flooding that no damage control party could hope to contain. The destroyer Arashio attempted to execute the defensive maneuver she had trained for countless times, swinging broadside to position her guns for optimal defensive fire. But this maneuver, which might have worked against torpedo bombers approaching from predictable angles, proved disastrous against strafers attacking from wave-top height. 3 aircraft converged on Arashio simultaneously, their combined firepower absolutely overwhelming. The concentrated stream of armor-piercing rounds shredded her bridge, killed every officer stationed there, jammed her rudder controls, and destroyed her ability to maneuver. Out of control and with dead men at her helm, Arashio continued her turn and slammed directly into the transport Nojima Maru. The collision locked the 2 ships together in a catastrophic embrace. Fuel from ruptured tanks poured across both vessels and ignited, creating walls of flame that consumed everything combustible. Ammunition magazines cooked off, sending explosions rippling through both hulls. Men trapped aboard had nowhere to run, nowhere to seek safety. Some jumped into the ocean, choosing possible death by drowning over certain death by fire. Others simply died where they stood as flames engulfed them. From his position aboard the flagship, Admiral Kimura watched his convoy disintegrate before his eyes and felt the foundations of his understanding of naval warfare crumble. The defensive doctrine he had trusted absolutely, that had been drilled into him through decades of training and experience, was proving utterly worthless against this new form of attack. His destroyers, which were supposed to create an impenetrable umbrella of steel, were being systematically destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. His transports, which he had been charged with protecting, were being torn apart one after another. Desperate signals flashed between ships, orders for evasive maneuvers, for concentrated fire, for anything that might salvage the situation. But the reality was that the convoy had been caught by surprise, attacked in a manner they had never anticipated, and was now paying the price for tactical rigidity. The ships couldn't maneuver quickly enough to evade attacks coming from wave-top height at 300 miles per hour. The guns couldn't depress fast enough or track quickly enough to hit targets that appeared and disappeared in seconds. The transport Oigawa Maru tried to execute a hard turn that might have presented a smaller target profile, but the maneuver only exposed her entire broadside to approaching strafers. Multiple aircraft lined up their attacks, their tracers converging on the transport like spokes of a deadly wheel. Machine gun rounds chewed through deck plating, tore into superstructure, killed men by the dozens. Then a skip bomb struck perfectly, punching through the hull and detonating inside a cargo hold where fuel drums and ammunition crates had been stored in violation of safety protocols. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. Oigawa Maru quite literally came apart, her hull splitting open, her interior consumed by a fireball that incinerated everything within. The blast wave propagated through the ship at supersonic speed, killing instantly anyone close to the detonation point. Soldiers in adjacent compartments died from overpressure that liquefied their internal organs. The transport's back broke, her bow and stern sections beginning to separate even as flames consumed everything. Within 90 seconds of being hit, Oigawa Maru had ceased to exist as a ship and had become merely a collection of burning debris sliding beneath the waves. 15 minutes. From the moment the first strafer opened fire until the last attack run was completed, only 15 minutes elapsed. In that quarter-hour span, an entire convoy was annihilated. 8 transports that had been carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers were sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers were destroyed outright, sent to the bottom with their crews. The remaining destroyers were damaged, their defensive capabilities shattered, their crews traumatized and demoralized. The ocean surface transformed from relatively calm seas into a hellscape of burning oil, floating debris, and struggling survivors. The men who found themselves suddenly fighting for their lives in the water faced a nightmare beyond imagining. Those who weren't killed in the initial attacks or subsequent explosions now had to deal with burning oil spreading across the surface, threatening to broil them alive. Debris from shattered ships presented hazards that could crush or impale. And then the American aircraft returned, their pilots following orders to ensure that no organized groups of survivors could be rescued and reformed into effective military units. Machine gun fire stitched across the water, tearing through lifeboats, killing men clinging to wreckage, turning what might have been a rescue operation into a massacre. The moral complexity of these actions would be debated for decades afterward, but in the heat of combat, the pilots were following orders based on strategic calculations. Every soldier who survived and reached friendly territory represented a future threat to Allied forces. The decision had been made at command levels that survivors would not be allowed to regroup. Japanese sailors and soldiers who witnessed their comrades being gunned down in the water while helplessly clinging to debris would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Those who survived to be pulled from the ocean by the damaged destroyers emerged traumatized, many going into shock, some simply staring blankly ahead with expressions that suggested their minds had retreated to somewhere safer than the memories they now carried. On the surviving destroyers, the scenes were almost beyond description. Decks were littered with bodies, some intact, others torn apart by machine gun fire or shrapnel. Blood ran in streams towards scuppers, mixing with seawater washing across the decks. Equipment was smashed, gun mounts twisted, superstructure riddled with holes. The wounded screamed for medics who were themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. Officers who had survived tried to restore some semblance of order, but many were in shock themselves, struggling to process what had just occurred. Admiral Kimura, surveying the wreckage of his command, understood immediately that this defeat transcended normal combat losses. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Pacific naval warfare. The assumptions that had guided Japanese convoy operations, the doctrine that had promised safe passage for properly defended transport groups, had been revealed as dangerously obsolete. An entire division's worth of troops had been lost, not through poor seamanship or tactical errors, but because the enemy had developed a weapons system against which traditional defences were useless. News of the disaster raced through Japanese military channels with the speed that only catastrophic defeats achieve. Initial reports were confused, incomplete, hardly believed by commanders who received them. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, nearly 7,000 casualties? The numbers seemed impossible, the result of some terrible exaggeration or communication error. But as more complete information arrived, as survivor testimonies were collected, as the damaged destroyers limped into port, the full magnitude of the catastrophe became undeniable. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the implications were staggering. If convoys could no longer sail safely within range of Allied air bases, then how could garrisons be supplied? How could reinforcements be moved? How could the Empire's defensive perimeter be maintained? Officers gathered in conference rooms to study what information was available, trying to understand what had happened and how defences might be restructured. But the conclusion kept presenting itself unavoidably. The Americans had developed a tactical innovation that rendered traditional convoy defence doctrine obsolete. The psychological impact rippled through every level of the naval service. Sailors who had previously felt reasonably safe aboard destroyers escorting convoys now understood that those ships were vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. Gun crews who had trained endlessly in anti-aircraft defence realised their skills were inadequate against attackers coming in at wave-top height. Officers who had risen through ranks by mastering traditional naval doctrine now faced the reality that their expertise was based on assumptions that no longer held true. Meanwhile, at Allied air bases across the region, returning crews were met with scenes of jubilation. Ground crews who had worked themselves to exhaustion installing gun modifications and training pilots in skip bombing techniques finally saw their efforts validated in spectacular fashion. Intelligence officers compiled damage assessments from pilot reports and reconnaissance photographs, tallying up the destruction and barely believing the totals themselves. Commanders drafted reports that would soon make headlines back in America and Australia, telling a war-weary public about a tremendous victory won through ingenuity and courage. The air crews themselves reacted with a complex mix of emotions. Relief at having survived, certainly. The mission had been extraordinarily dangerous, and not everyone had come back. Pride in what they had accomplished, in proving that the new tactics worked exactly as hoped. But also a kind of stunned recognition of the destruction they had wrought, the thousands of men they had killed in the space of minutes. Combat veterans develop various psychological mechanisms for dealing with the reality of killing, but the sheer scale of what had just occurred left many crewmen subdued despite the overall triumph. Photographs taken during and after the battle showed seas choked with wreckage, ships listing heavily or already slipping beneath the waves, oil slicks spreading for miles, tiny figures of survivors visible clinging to debris. These images would appear in newspapers, in military intelligence reports, in post-war histories. They became iconic representations of American air power's growing dominance in the Pacific, proof that Japanese forces were no longer invulnerable, evidence that the tide of war was shifting. For families back in Japan who had sent sons and husbands off with the 51st Division, the news arrived gradually and incompletely. Official notifications spoke of transport losses and casualties in deliberately vague terms, unwilling to admit the full scope of the disaster. Soldiers who had written final letters before boarding the transports had entrusted those letters to delivery systems that no longer existed. Photographs of young men in uniform would be all that remained for families who would never learn the exact circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. the strategic consequences manifested quickly. The garrison at Leh, which the convoy had been intended to reinforce and resupply, now faced slow starvation and eventual defeat. Other Japanese positions throughout New Guinea found themselves similarly isolated as convoy operations were curtailed or abandoned entirely. Supplies that garrisons desperately needed, ammunition, food, medicine, failed to arrive. Troops began dying not from combat but from malnutrition, disease, and lack of medical care. The Japanese High Command attempted various solutions to the supply problem, but none proved adequate. Night convoys reduced exposure to air attack but couldn't carry sufficient volume. Submarine supply runs delivered some critical items but couldn't sustain entire garrisons. Fast destroyer runs minimized time in range of Allied aircraft, but couldn't transport heavy equipment or large troop numbers. Every alternative to traditional convoy operations represented an admission that American air power had achieved dominance over contested waters. This realization forced broader strategic recalculations. If the Empire's outer defensive perimeter couldn't be adequately supplied, then that perimeter would inevitably contract. Garrisons that couldn't be reinforced would eventually be overrun. Island strongholds that couldn't be provisioned would have to be evacuated or abandoned. The careful defensive strategy that Japanese planners had constructed began unraveling, not because of decisive fleet actions or dramatic invasions, but because of an innovation in tactical aviation that made supply operations untenable. The B-25 strafer, born from desperation in an Australian workshop, had achieved strategic effects far beyond what its creators initially imagined. What began as an attempt to solve a specific tactical problem, how to sink ships with available aircraft, ended up reshaping the entire campaign in the Southwest Pacific. The modifications that Pappy Gunn and his mechanics developed proliferated rapidly as more squadrons received the gun-laden bombers and trained in the devastating techniques that had proven themselves at the Bismarck Sea. Years later, military historians would trace direct lines of influence from those modified Mitchells to later aircraft types that carried forward the same basic philosophy. The AC-47 Spooky gunship that emerged during the Vietnam War mounted multiple machine guns firing from aircraft sides and proved devastatingly effective against ground targets. The AC-130 Spectre took the concept further, becoming a flying artillery platform capable of engaging targets with tremendous precision. Even the A-10 Warthog, designed around a massive 30mm cannon for close air support, embodied principles that had first been demonstrated when .850 caliber machine guns were mounted in a bomber's nose. The tactical innovations, forward-firing weapons, low-altitude attacks, skip bombing, all became part of the toolkit that air forces worldwide would study and incorporate. Military academies taught the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a case study in tactical innovation, in how field-level modifications and adaptive thinking could overcome doctrinal rigidity. The engagement demonstrated that victory in modern warfare often goes to forces that can iterate and adapt faster than their opponents, regardless of numerical or material advantages. For Japan, the defeat represented more than just one lost convoy or one failed mission. It symbolized a broader reality that the Empire's leadership was increasingly forced to confront. American industrial and innovative capacity was generating solutions to military problems faster than Japanese forces could adapt. The confidence that had characterized the early war years, built on dramatic victories at Pearl Harbor and throughout the Pacific, was eroding under the cumulative weight of engagements like the Bismarck Sea, where American forces demonstrated clear technological and tactical superiority. The human cost on both sides deserves recognition. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the space of minutes, most of them young men far from home, killed before they could even engage in the combat they had trained for. Allied air crews who participated in the attack carried memories of those minutes for the rest of their lives, the sight of ships exploding, of men desperately trying to escape burning vessels, of oil-covered survivors struggling in the water. War creates these moments where ordinary human beings inflict or suffer terrible violence, and the psychological burden of such experiences doesn't diminish with time or victory. Yet in the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea served as a turning point that accelerated Japan's eventual defeat. By demonstrating that convoys could no longer operate safely in contested waters, the battle effectively sealed off Japanese garrisons from resupply and reinforcement. This isolation doomed those garrisons to eventual destruction or evacuation, enabling Allied forces to advance steadily up the northern coast of New Guinea and eventually threaten the Philippines and the Japanese home islands themselves. The engagement also validated the principle that technological innovation need not require years of research and massive industrial investment. Sometimes breakthrough capabilities emerge from field modifications undertaken by mechanics working with available tools and materials. Papygun's team didn't have access to advanced research facilities or unlimited resources. They had wrecked aircraft, machine guns, mounting brackets, and the determination to make something work. That was enough. This lesson resonated beyond the immediate tactical situation. Throughout the war, in all theatres and among all combatants, there emerged countless examples of field innovations that proved decisive. Soldiers modified weapons, tactics evolved through hard experience. Officers who were willing to question doctrine gained advantages over those who remained rigid. The Bismarck Sea represented perhaps the most dramatic single example of this principle in the Pacific theatre, but the broader phenomenon shaped the entire conflict. For the sailors who survived the attack and eventually returned to Japan, the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of naval warfare. They had witnessed firsthand how quickly the rules could change, how devastating it was to face a threat that doctrine hadn't prepared them for. Some carried physical scars from wounds received during the battle. All carried psychological scars from watching their ships torn apart, their comrades killed, their confidence in Japanese naval superiority shattered. The officers who had commanded during the battle faced various fates. Some were held accountable for the disaster, though in truth there was little they could have done differently given the circumstances. Japanese military culture placed tremendous emphasis on success and tended to view defeat as a moral failure rather than simply an outcome of combat against a better equipped or more innovative enemy. This cultural tendency meant that officers who survived major defeats often faced professional ruin or worse, regardless of whether their decisions had actually contributed to the outcome. Admiral Kimura himself survived physically, but carried the weight of the disaster for the rest of his life. He had commanded a convoy that ceased to exist in 15 minutes, had watched nearly 7,000 men die under his protection, had proven unable to defend against an attack type that his training had never addressed. Whether fair or not, such outcomes define military careers and historical legacies. Kimura would be remembered primarily for this one engagement, for this catastrophic failure, regardless of whatever else he accomplished before or after. The mechanics and innovators who created the strafer modification achieved recognition, but often of a quiet sort that didn't translate into historical fame. Papygun received some official acknowledgement for his work, but remained relatively unknown outside aviation circles. The mechanics who actually installed guns, tested modifications, solved technical problems through trial and error, their names rarely appear in historical accounts despite their crucial contributions. This reflects a broader truth about military innovation. The people who actually create breakthrough capabilities often labor in obscurity, while commanders and political leaders receive the credit and recognition. The pilots who flew those first combat missions in modified strafers deserve particular recognition for sheer courage. They were flying untested modifications into concentrated anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where any hit would be fatal. They had to maintain precise course and speed while tracers streaked past their canopies and shells exploded nearby. They had to trust that the modifications would hold together under combat stresses, that the guns would function as promised, that the skip bombing technique would work in actual battle conditions rather than just in practice. The fact that they succeeded so dramatically speaks to their skill, training, and sheer nerve. The broader implications of the Bismarck Sea extended into post-war military thinking as well. When air forces worldwide began studying how air power might be used in future conflicts, the engagement served as a key example of how aircraft could dominate naval operations given proper tactics and weaponry. This influenced aircraft design, training curricula, and operational doctrine for decades. The fundamental principle that aircraft armed with forward-firing weapons could devastate surface targets if they attacked at low altitude with sufficient firepower became incorporated into standard tactical thinking. In a larger sense, the battle illustrated how warfare constantly evolves and how military organizations that fail to evolve with it face catastrophic consequences. The Japanese convoy defense doctrine that proved so inadequate at the Bismarck Sea had been effective earlier in the war. It wasn't inherently flawed or poorly conceived, but when faced with a genuinely new threat, strafers attacking at wave-top height, the doctrine provided no useful guidance and the defensive measures it prescribed proved worthless. This reality creates a fundamental dilemma for military planners everywhere. How to maintain forces trained and equipped for current threats while simultaneously preparing for threats that don't yet exist. The resources devoted to one approach cannot simultaneously be devoted to another. The Japanese Navy had invested enormous time and treasure in creating a system of convoy defense that worked against known threats. They had not anticipated that an entirely new attack method would emerge from Australian workshops, and so they were unprepared when it did. Could they have prepared? Could intelligence efforts have detected the modifications being made to B-25s? Could Japanese doctrine have been flexible enough to incorporate defenses against low-altitude strafing attacks before those attacks actually occurred? These questions have occupied military analysts for decades and have no simple answers. The reality is that innovation often emerges from unexpected places and manifests in ways that established intelligence systems don't detect until it's too late. The emotional and psychological dimensions of the battle deserve exploration as well. For the Japanese soldiers packed into the transport's holds, their experience was one of utter helplessness. They heard the sounds of combat above, gunfire, explosions, running feet, shouted orders, but couldn't see what was happening or do anything to affect the outcome. When explosions tore through their ships, they died without having fired a shot, without having faced an enemy they could fight. This must have been terrifying beyond measure, understanding that death was imminent but having no agency, no ability to resist or defend themselves. The Allied air crews experienced a very different kind of psychological burden. They could see the effects of their attacks, watching ships explode and burn, witnessing men dying by the hundreds. The later strafing runs against survivors in the water particularly weighed on some crews, who understood they were killing defenseless men. The moral complexity of such actions, following orders that served strategic purposes but conflicted with some fundamental human instincts about fair combat, created psychological tensions that some crew members struggled with for years afterward. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of those engagements where innovation, preparation, and execution came together to produce a result far more decisive than anyone had anticipated. It validated the principle that creativity and adaptation can overcome material advantages and established doctrine. It demonstrated that control of contested waters depended increasingly on air superiority rather than naval forces alone. And it provided a brutal lesson to all military organizations about the dangers of doctrinal rigidity and the necessity of continuous adaptation to changing threats. The 8 transports and 4 destroyers that now rest on the floor of the Bismarck Sea serve as monuments to these lessons. Their broken hulls, scattered across the seabed, mark not just the graves of thousands of men, but also the death of an era in naval warfare. The assumptions that had guided convoy operations, the confidence that proper defensive measures could ensure safe passage, the belief in Japanese naval invincibility, all these perished along with those ships. What rose from those waters was a new understanding of how air and sea power interact, an understanding that would shape military operations for generations to come.